Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Steve Hunegs. I'm the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas. Definitely appreciate the Capitol Press Corps participating, covering our press conference today. Thank you to my fellow speakers, everybody that's here today. Senator Latz for hosting us here on the Senate. Thank you to Kenny for Senate Media Services, the wonderful ally, Diane. Very much appreciate this opportunity. Let's start with this point, and that is, keeping our minds on the relief of the families in Israel whose loved ones have been released from captivity. Also thinking about the agony of those families whose loved ones remain in captivity, all against the backdrop or the barbarity of Hamas, which actually brings us to this point. Case in point to the little family of Yarden and Shira Bibas and their 10-month-old Kafir and their 4-year-old child, too, still in captivity. Perhaps no one even knows where they are, offloaded in a sense to another terrorist organization in Gaza. And today's date is a special date in history, and also a date in which things could have gone differently. And that is, today is November 29. This is the 76th anniversary of the UN partition vote on Palestine. You can see I have in my hand the report of the UNSCOP, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine. And on November 29, 1947, the United Nations voted to partition the Palestine Mandate of the British into Jewish and Arab states. Had only then the road been taken by Arab states and the Palestinians for a Palestinian state alongside a Jewish state, we might not be here today. So please keep that in mind. The history of Minnesota's support for Israel goes well back, even before the creation of the state in 1948. In 1919, Minnesota was the 9th state through its House of Representatives to affirm the Balfour Declaration and Jewish national aspirations in Palestine. Fast forward to this day, a month ago or so, 50 days ago or so, Governor Walz having an Israeli flag fly at the governor's residence, the illumination of the I-35W bridge in blue and white at that time. We're deeply grateful to the governor and Senator Klobuchar and all the political leaders, Representative Emmer, for their support for Israel at this time. Here's the salient point, and I go back again in history to December 2nd, 1945, just a few months after the end of the war, just a few months after the end of the Holocaust. Because on that date, the Arab League announced a boycott of all Jewish products and commerce in mandatory Palestine. They said, quote, Jewish products and manufactured goods shall be considered undesirable in the Arab countries. Now let's think about that date for a second. That's 3 years before the creation of the State of Israel. That's 19 years before the Six-Day War. And yet there was economic warfare. There could be no other justification than anti-Semitism. What you're seeing today at the state capitol, this so-called BDS rally, is nothing but the progeny and legacy of this pure economic warfare against Israel, the Jewish state, simply because people living in Israel are Jewish. It's by definition sort of the essence of anti-Semitism. And when you see BDS rallies and the like, that's what we need to keep in mind. But of course, I want to end on a more positive note. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. Because this organization, the JCRC, stands for affirmation of all human life, certainly that of Israelis, certainly that of Palestinians in Gaza, who, as much as the Israelis in some sense are held hostage by Hamas, but also the possibility of a two-state solution, going back to November 29, 1947, and that is important for all of us to keep in mind at this time. So thank you, Press Corps, for coming today. We really appreciate it, and I'll turn it over to Shai. Shai, thank you.
Israel has the right to defend itself. Israel has the right to defend itself. This is the sentence you keep hearing from supporters of the people of Israel during the past month and a half. What do they mean by this sentence? They mean that Israel has the right to protect and defend all its citizens, whether of Jewish, Christian, Muslim, or any other religious faith, from terrorists to beheaded men, women, and even babies. From terrorists to murdered 347 innocent civilians who went to a music festival. from terrorists who set their houses on fire while they were hiding in them, from terrorists who raped and then killed women and young girls, from terrorists who kidnapped over 240 people, including babies, kids, women, men, and the elderly, and from terrorists who have stated their intent to commit the crimes of October 7th over and over again until they've reached the complete destruction of Israel. In the past 3 weeks, Israel went to Gaza to make sure these events will not happen again. This is a war that Israel did not want. Hamas chose a different path for itself and its people. I always felt most of the civilians in Gaza were innocent and wanted to live in peace side by side. This past month and a half showed me how Hamas and many people in Gaza want to destroy the Jewish people and the country which is the Jewish homeland. In Gaza, they are using Hitler as a role model for Jew hatred. The IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, found Mein Kampf in Arabic in Hamas terrorist belonging. They found hidden explosive under kids' beds, in civilians' homes, and in United Nations schools. Rockets in civilians' buildings next to other schools, and tunnels and weapons under every hospital. The video documentation provides proof of this, although the IDF has held this intelligence and shared this publicly for years. Hamas terrorists brought hostages to the hospital on October 7th. Do not be confused. They did not bring them to treat them. They brought them to the hospital to make sure Israel will not attack them, because the IDF will not airstrike a hospital full of civilians. As of this time, there are still over 150 kidnapped Israelis being held hostage in Gaza: children, teens, women, men, and elderly. 2 days ago, Eitan Yahalomi, a 12-year-old boy, was released as part of a hostage deal. He told his family he was beaten by civilians on the street when he was kidnapped into Gaza. He also told them that Hamas forced him to watch terrifying videos from the terror attacks on October 7th. A 12-year-old boy, alone, watching the worst nightmare you can imagine. This is a twisted form of torture for a child to endure. This is Hamas. Roni Krivyo, a Russian-Israeli national, was at the music festival on October 7th. When he was kidnapped into Gaza by Hamas, at some point, he managed to escape. He tried for 4 days to make his way back to Israel until civilians from Gaza found him and turned him into Hamas. He shared this story when he was released a few days ago in hostage deal brokered between Russia and Hamas. The entire Bivas family is still in Gaza. Hostages: Yarden Bivas, 34 years old. Shiri Bivas, 32 years old. Ariel Bivas, 4 years old. And Kfir Bivas, now 10 months old. I repeat, Ariel Bivas, 4 years old. And Kfir Bivas, 10 months old. This is unacceptable, not for Israeli, not for Americans, not for humanity, not for anyone with common sense. If you can live with the fact that children have been kidnapped and being held hostage by the cruelest and the most barbaric terrorist who imitate the Nazis and ISIS, and you don't understand why Israel is at war, you should check your moral compass. I think it's broken. Israel has the right to defend itself. Full stop.
Hi, good morning. I didn't prepare anything in advance, so I was going to speak from my heart. Born and raised in Israel, in Haifa. I was actually in Israel on October 7, visiting family. I'm very lucky that me and all my family were safe. And I was able to come back eventually back home here in Minnesota, where I've been living in the last few years. But me being able to return to my bed here, I cannot stop think about the around 130 people who are still held captive with Hamas. Women, men, children, elderly, in the dark with barely any food. So I think it's really important for us to be there and be a voice for them, because as many of them indicated, the hostages that was released, they were unable to speak while they were there. They had to be silent. They had to whisper. Still, the kids that are now released, their parents saying that they can barely hear them because they're whispering. So I think it's important for us to speak loud and to be their voice. One of the things that I think struck me most coming back here is the feeling that, in a weird sense, I felt more safe in Israel than I do here because of the rise in anti-Semitism, everything that's going on in the streets across the country and across the world, in universities, in schools. And I think all of that is evidence why Israel, as the only Jewish state, is so important for all of us. And Israel was founded on similar principles like America. And it's really important for it to exist. And we need to stand with Israel, because standing for Israel is standing for America, and it's standing for humanity.
Hi, my name is Rhona Shwaid. I live in Minneapolis, and I serve on the board of the Jewish Community Relations Council. The Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, known as BDS, is a campaign aimed at delegitimizing Israel through financial isolation of Israel and at isolating Jews, like me, who support Israel's right to exist. Instead of advocating for a peaceful two-state solution, the BDS movement seeks to dismantle Israel and end the right of Jewish self-determination in our ancestral homeland. Although the BDS campaign is largely nonviolent, it has strikingly similar aims to those that we see from terrorist organizations like Hamas, who perpetrated the deadliest massacre of Jewish people on October 7th since the Holocaust, and whose charter also calls for the end of Israel, Zionism, and Jews. While some supporters of BDS may genuinely believe that financial isolation of Israel is a productive way to effect change in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, BDS campaigns which treat Israel as an oppressive pariah are one-sided, distorted, and further contribute to a hostile environment toward Israelis and Jewish people who overwhelmingly view Israel as central to their identities. Instead of supporting constructive measures toward peace building and Israeli-Palestinian engagement and negotiations, BDS recognizes only the rights of Palestinians to self-determination instead of both peoples, and ignores other actors and factors that contribute to the conflict. Finally, the BDS movement is known to use anti-Semitic rhetoric, including tropes related to outsized Jewish power, dual loyalties, and greed. So, how does this impact us as members of the Jewish community in Minnesota? In a November 2023 survey by the Jewish Electorate Institute, 93% of respondents said that they are concerned about anti-Semitism in America. And according to the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, in the month following October 7th, anti-Semitic incidents in the U.S. increased by 316%. At a time when Jews all over the world are facing what Dr. Lipstadt, the U.S. envoy on anti-Semitism, has called a tsunami of anti-Semitism, including the Jewish community here in Minnesota, it would be irresponsible and dangerous for the state of Minnesota to further hostilities and trauma by supporting a movement that is anti-Zionist and anti-Jewish at its core. With the October 7th massacre fresh in our minds and still heavy in our hearts, I strongly urge the State Board of Investment not to join the BDS movement in boycotting and isolating Israel, especially at a time where the country is suffering such monumental losses from the war with Hamas and the ongoing efforts to bring all innocent civilians home. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm State Senator Ron Latz from St. Louis Park. When Senator Warren Limmer and I carried the anti-BDS bill in 2017, we confronted the question of what is BDS and why should we oppose it. That bill, now law, prohibited state contractors from discriminating against Israel or against persons or entities doing business in Israel when making decisions relating to the operation of the vendor's business. There was then, and there still is, a history of demonizing Israel in certain realms of public affairs and of looking for mechanisms to promote the elimination of the State of Israel under the guise of more rational-appearing aims, such as reforming it or improving it or driving it to the bargaining table or simply trying to end the so-called occupation by Israel of ill-gotten land. The more benign stated goals of the anti-Israel activists included causing Israel to agree to a two-state solution or to withdraw unequivocally from the occupied lands of Gaza and the West Bank. We saw then, and even more clearly now, how false were their proclamations of benign intent. Israel withdrew all of its military and civilians from Gaza in 2005, and Hamas turned it into a terrorist haven and launching pad for attempted military annihilation of Israel by igniting the Iranian ring of resistance surrounding Israel, rather than turning it into a thriving economic and cultural center for Palestinians and Muslims. Israel also made direct offers of two-state solutions over the years and faced rejection by Palestinian liberation movement leaders each time. There is little left for Israel to concede that would not jeopardize its very existence. We have seen in recent weeks how poisonous Gaza has become for Israel. It challenges the very foundation of the idea of two states peacefully coexisting side by side. Now, Palestinian children are taught at United Nations UNRWA schools that Jews should be killed. They attend summer camps that teach young kids how to be terrorists. They play Kill the Jew on the streets of Gaza. Children's television shows glorify the killing of Jews, and UNRWA-run elementary school playground toys are plastic AK-47s. Palestinian youth dream of the opportunity to achieve glory and even martyrdom by killing as many Jews as possible. Is it any wonder that these same children grow up and call their parents after slaughtering innocent concert-goers in the desert to brag about killing 10 Jews, saying, "Mama, aren't you proud of me?" Who use rape as a weapon of war? Who gleefully paraded the naked body of a desecrated, captive Jewish woman through the streets of Gaza while the Gazan crowds cheered and spit on the body? We know all this from their own recordings. Whose culture of martyrdom encourages children to risk their lives in the greater cause of eliminating Jews. Who are chanting from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, which is an unequivocal call for the annihilation of Israel, like they did at the rally on the Minnesota Capitol steps in the early days following October 7th. who carry the signs at pro-Palestine rallies around the world that call for cleansing of the world by throwing Jews into the trash can, and who fail to condemn with equal fervor the hundreds of thousands of Muslims who have been killed by other Muslims in Yemen and Syria, whose ire is reserved only for Jews and Israel. Witness the absolutely deafening silence of the international women's rights groups when the mass rape victims are Israeli Jews and the perpetrators are Hamas Palestinians. Witnesses hiding in the bushes at the Nova Music Festival saw terrorists game rape, then murder and mutilate women by cutting off their breasts. A Hamas video from a kibbutz shows terrorists torturing a pregnant woman and removing her fetus. Israeli forensic scientists have found bodies of women and girls raped with such violence that their pelvic bones were broken. Videos widely disseminated show a woman hostage in Gaza, still alive, in bloodied pants, held captive at gunpoint, being pulled into a jeep by her hair. This evidence, along with the explicit recorded confessions of captured terrorists, makes abundantly clear that mass rape was a premeditated part of Hamas's plan. Yet organizations like UN Women and the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women have said nothing. Hamas just released 12-year-old Eitan Yachalomi, a child from kibbutz Nir Oz, as Shai has already remarked, who was abducted during the October 7 terror attack. He spent over 50 days being tortured by Hamas, having him watch video recordings of the atrocities in Israel over and over again, and being told that he would be beaten if he did not watch, and that he would be killed, or if he or any other kidnapped child started crying. This is what Israel is facing now. What would you do if your children would be treated like that? Harmed mentally and emotionally for life? And how would it look if your allies tried to prevent you from saving these innocent citizens from their torturers? Or tried to weaken them and pressure them to walk away from a war they did not start, from a war that will get much worse if their enemy is not destroyed? By definition, divesting from Israel would be supporting and motivating a terror group to repeat the October 7 atrocities again, as they have themselves promised to do. It is against this backdrop that we again must confront and answer the question of what is BDS? What is the goal that they seek to accomplish? In my view, BDS is simply another manifestation of the ubiquitous Jew hatred and Israel hatred and anti-Zionism. But don't just accept my opinion on it. Listen to the founders and leaders of the BDS movement in their own words. Omar Barghouti, co-founder of the BDS movement, said, "Palestinians have a right to resistance by any means, including armed resistance. Jews aren't indigenous just because you say you are. Jews are not a people. The UN's principle of the right to self-determination applies only to colonized people who want to acquire their rights. Definitely, most definitely, we oppose a Jewish state in any part of Palestine. No Palestinian, rational Palestinian, not a sellout Palestinian, will ever accept a Jewish state in Palestine." Professor Asad Abu Khalil, political scientist and prominent BDS supporter, said, "Professor Finkelstein rightly asks whether the real aim of BDS is to bring down the state of Israel. Here, I agree with him that it is. That should be stated as an unambiguous goal. There should not be any equivocation on the subject. Justice and freedom for the Palestinians are incompatible with the existence of the state of Israel." Ahmed Moore, Palestinian BDS activist, said, "Okay, fine, so BDS does mean the end of the Jewish state. BDS is not another step on the way to the final showdown. BDS is the final showdown." This is the central core philosophy of BDS. The divestment part of it is part of this central aim. And I will depart from my pre-written remarks just to comment on the rally that I just witnessed in our rotunda up above us. Some of the signs at this BDS rally include no pension money for genocide. They have a wanted poster with Governor Tim Walz mocking the hostages that Hamas took into the Gaza Strip. Divest apartheid. Free Palestine, which means eliminate Israel. There's one more I want to call to your attention, which was particularly galling, and I'm not going to mince words here. It says, Zionists, fuck off. This is the BDS movement. Now, do we need to address the moral reasons to support Israel, or similarly, to not divest from the only democracy in the Middle East, the most critical and reliable strategic ally of the United States in the region, the source of amazing and world-changing innovation in agriculture, science, computers, etc., whose innovation may well be necessary to save the planet from climate change? Damaging Israel would make all of this harder to sustain, and weakening Israel and raising doubts about the reliability of the U.S. as a solid ally would only make it harder for Israel to ultimately take the risks for peace and a two-state solution. Divestment would move the needle in the wrong direction. Instead, it would give comfort and encouragement to a movement fundamentally dedicated to the destruction of Israel. So, for moral, strategic, and practical reasons, divestment as part of the boycott, divest, and sanction movement would be a profound mistake. You don't divest a victim of an attack. You don't boycott because a democratic country is defending its citizens from a terrorist group. You don't punish a country that is the only one in this war that is following the international rules of war. If the same atrocities had happened in the U.S., if right now we had our children and women and innocent victims kidnapped and tortured, and our government needed to defend to make sure our citizens would be safe, would you think our allies would try to weaken us financially in our time of need? Oh, wait. We do have innocent American citizens being held hostage right now by Hamas. Surely we should not promote weakening the only country who has the on-the-ground capacity and resolve, and yes, bargaining chips, to force Hamas to release the Americans. In 1973, Golda Meir, then the Prime Minister of Israel, after narrowly escaping defeat following the surprise attack by Egypt and Syria, and then turning the military tables on Egypt, would not agree to a ceasefire with Egypt until Egyptian President Sadat would refer to her as the Prime Minister of Israel. Using this terminology, de facto recognized Israel as a legitimate country rather than the hated Zionist entity. Do these words sound familiar? When the anti-Zionists in BDS and the pro-Palestinian protesters at the Capitol today and Palestinian leadership are prepared to recognize the legitimacy of the State of Israel, then peace may be possible. BDS, like Hamas, aims to destroy Israel. It is a dangerous diversion from the path toward peace. We must not give comfort and support to the terrorists of Hamas. The Minnesota State Board of Investments should reject all efforts to divest from Israel. That concludes our formal presentation here in the press conference. We are happy to take questions from members of the press.
Senator, have you spoken with any members of the board and portrayed to them your thoughts and feelings about this?
I have not.
Have you had conversations with DFL colleagues who possibly stand on the opposing side of this?
Not about this question, no.
Do you know the scope of the investments that these protesters are asking the state to divest from? Like how much money or where?
Yeah, there's a number that I saw several years ago of about $87 million, and I'm not sure if that is the actual investments from the board or if that is a broader term relating to Minnesota economic activity or exchange with Israel. Some of the folks from the JCRC might have a number that I'm not aware of, however.
Minnesota has a small holding in Israel bonds. Oh, sorry. Pardon me. Minnesota has a, particularly with respect to the size of the overall pension fund, has a small holding in Israel bonds dating back to the 1980s, and somewhere, recollection's a little foggy, maybe Senator Latz can help, $10-20 million in that neighborhood.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Have the Para Board or the Board of Investment has ever, divested from anything in response to protest or complaints?
Iran.
Ron?
And Russia, after the invasion of Ukraine.
Hi, Ethan Roberts, Deputy Executive Director. The State Pension Board has never chosen as a board to divest. There is state laws, which in the context of Iran and in the context of Russia and Belarus, but that took legislative action. Not aware of any time that the State Board of Investment, we have been in contact with members of the board. We are not expecting them to take up the call, the demand to divest from Israel. No reasonable constitutional officer would do that, and we have 4 reasonable constitutional officers.
Could they do, in theory, could they make that call themselves? Because I remember the Russia divestment from last session, and that was a law. Does it take the legislature, regardless of if they even wanted to do this?
I'd have to get back to you on that because it's never happened before, but they would be doing so against a very strong advice of the professional staff. To the question of how much money is at stake here, it's always a moving target. So it's been at times about the Israel bonds, as Steve Hunegs, our executive director, mentioned, but other times it's just other businesses, Israeli businesses, American businesses. If they were really consistent, they would probably demand a divestment from Medtronic, right? They demand the divestment from Apple, Google, right? We literally couldn't have this press conference if the logical conclusion of their demands was fulfilled, because every aspect of what you're using to do this press conference, to capture this, has an Israeli technology embedded within it. And so they're not rational actors, and so their demands aren't rational, but it's a moving target, so it's hard to pin a number on it.
What was your name?
Sorry, I'm Ethan Roberts. I'm the Deputy Executive Director at the JCRC, and I'm also our lead person on legislative affairs. Ethan with an E. Ethan with an E, yes. Is there another way to do it? But yes.
Senator Latz, can you talk about varying opinions within the DFL party about the conflict so far? And, whether there are any splits in opinions?
Well, I don't have any specifics to offer you. It's been well reported already that there are a variety of views ideologically within our Senate DFL caucus and within the House DFL caucus as well. So I'm sure there are varying views on this particular topic. There are a number of members of the Senate DFL caucus that have issued statements following October 7th and that have made independent calls for ceasefire, which is a separate a policy discussion from the one we're having here today. And there's been well-reported dissension within the state DFL party over the participation of DSA, which has issued its own statements following the October 7th massacre, ignoring the massacre itself in their statement, certainly in their initial statement. So beyond that, I can't speak to any specifics.
The divisions, though, within the party on this, it seems to be the far left that have taken the views of maybe the people upstairs. I'm wondering, do you feel like those divides have deepened because of this? I don't think that they didn't come out of nowhere, they've been there, but has this situation exacerbated those divisions?
Well, this is certainly a more impactful and emotional time for those who have family, relatives, or interests in the region. For those who support Palestinian aspirations for statehood, as do I, by the way, as well as the defense of Israel against hostile atrocities. So I think it's fair to say that everyone is troubled by the loss of any innocent lives. Are the divisions within the legislative membership deepened by this? I'm not sure that I could say. I suspect they're more emotionally felt today than they were October 6th, when, by the way, there was an active ceasefire.
Hearing no other questions, thank you. Thank you to my JCRC colleagues, and thank you to everybody who came today.
If
Thank
you
very
need
much.
spellings of any of the names.